significant impact to ESM, how it's loaded, semantic changes, normative changes, whatever you want to call them. We're not landing those right now. In particular, like anything that's controversial shouldn't land. And we came to this after various meetings where people wanted to go over use cases before we get to goals, before we talk about implementation. And yeah, there's disagreement even on if we should be able to land PRs at all, or if we need to halt all progress. But we'll see. For now, we're not landing anything that we're going to discuss in this coming slide deck. We also don't have a mechanism for if a PR is okay to land, but we seem to be okay with landing fixes to existing implementation. Bug fixes, better error messages, that kind of stuff. So yeah. So we were just talking about MIMEs. Clear to Node.js. Well, Timothy has a question. Should we make this clear to Node.js Node collaborators? We need a charter before we can say that officially, Timothy. So once we charter, we can say that. We probably will.
I mean, we can recommend it already, and the TAC can back that recommendation. We could already do that today and kick that off. It'd be different than what we've done before, but there's nothing really stopping us from doing that kind of thing.
Okay, well, maybe we can look into that after this meeting. So yeah, the first on our list is super relevant to our discussion we just had. The mode field being added to package.json. This was implemented by Guy Bedford. So basically what it does is it selects the format for files when they're being loaded. So currently in the PR, we're at one mode that's valid, which is the ESM string. And it changes .js files to have the ESM format. We talked about loaders earlier. We're not using MIME types right now for things. We're using this format field. And so ESM is the module MIME type or format, whatever you want to call it for now. In particular, since it's a string, we can expand it to any arbitrary number of possible values. For now, there's only one. Changing mode to ESM, which is the only valid thing, doesn't do anything to .mjs files. It just kind of lets them be. So let's talk about a quick little thing. So if we were to, have a package.json and mode ESM, importing, within our package, ./foo.js would be treated as ESM. But when we're importing across packages, so like importing bar, which is a different package, and bars foo.js, we don't know what it is because that's in a different thing. So important to this is the first time that we've talked about introducing a concept of a package boundary in Node core. So we talk about package JSON files, but we don't actually talk about packages in our documentation right now. We always talk about modules, which are the things that make up a package. In this PR, the concept of a package boundary is basically a directory containing a package.json file. It's not about being inside of Node modules or not. So you can have, like Justin was saying, a directory with a package.json file that's not located inside of Node modules. It could be in a vendor directory, dist directory, I don't know, anywhere you can imagine. So important to this is there are some other things that we can start using about this. So we already have a package main field cache inside of Node. And so we can kind of share this. When we check for mode, we can also find the main during that time and not have to do this multiple times. Along with that, once we do this, we only have to iterate up to the root of the file system once and everything's cached. So even if you have a fairly large depth graph, if it's very shallow, your total number of possible lookups upward is very shallow and it's cached. If it's very deep, it'll only happen once, and anything that branches out in a wider way, not deep, will also be able to benefit from that lookup. So yeah, it's a little bit interesting that you can have multiple scopes in a single like npm package if you have multiple package.json files. But I think that seems reasonable and okay, even if naming is a little hard. So some designs were taken into consideration when Guy was designing this. npm had a proposal in January that had this -- mode flag. And this mode field in the package.json, it doesn't have a way to specify the format of an entry point right now. If you go and you read the PR, it looks like this -- mode or -- format, whichever, can be added as a PR afterwards. So we can kind of take a slower iterative approach and refine these as we go along. So when we were talking about MIME types earlier, this can roughly be seen as a way to select the MIME type database for your package. And in particular, it's a little bit difficult to integrate with loaders right now. If you set this flag, they need to also learn about the mode and all the possible mappings. So it may be good to allow loaders to integrate this directly. It also, if you take a look at that, loaders may also want some non-standard mode in their package.json because they're doing something like TypeScript or Flow, JSX, don't know, any possible combination of those. So yeah, so that's the first PR we have, and I'll check if we have questions. Nothing. Okay. So our next PR that we're going to talk about is having multiple loaders able to be composed via command line arguments. So I wrote this one. It basically lets you have -- loader and then the specifier for the loader multiple times inside of a single way of running Node from the command line. It also has some breaking changes to the loader APIs to better serve composition. It's still flexible. We can still change, how composition works from the JS API perspective, but we do some isolation of loaders and things like that, which I'd probably want to preserve. But the basic thing is when you type out your node command to be run, the furthest one on the right or the last declared -loader is the first to run, and it runs from right to left. So some people might think it runs left to right. No, it runs right to left for our case. And we can discuss that, and that's able to change. Whew. So how do you use this? Basically, you have it via the command line or via the environment variables option. Node options in particular inserts itself right after the node executable path. And so these two are fundamentally equivalent. They will load APM and then they'll load JSX, and any imports will resolve first through JSX and then through APM. So yeah. all the loaders also, I should mention, do affect each other. So in this case, since JSX is loaded after APM, APM can intercept the JSX specifier string and do with it what it will. So it introduces something, some controversial things that are not readily apparent when people first want to use this. If you want to, you can have your loader prevent calling the parent loader. Like you could just throw an error, or you could prohibit loading a specific file because of privacy reasons. You could also be doing some things like you have a cached loader. And so you run your program once and it produces a cache for every result, and then that's that. When it loads up a second time, it loads it out of the cache using code cache of whatever mechanism you want. Unfortunately, kind of the nature of composing loaders means you have to manually call out to your parent loader, because your parent loader doesn't know if it should run before or after things. If we did it by a return value, that means that child loaders could only take action before the parent, but somewhat often children will want to call out to their parent, like the APM in this example, and have it do the resolve and then manually do a transform afterwards. Yeah, it's a middleware pattern, like Wes Wiggum was pointing out. Yeah. So we have some considerations whenever we're talking about multiple loaders that are really hard. Debug loaders like code instrumentation, code coverage, all of that generally shouldn't be skipped. I mentioned this briefly in a design document related to the multiple loaders PR for per package hooks. I basically punted on it and said people can detect process env, node env, and figure it out for now. I don't have a good solution. Maybe we'll want a solution that we endorse in the future. I don't know if we'll really need one. Whenever we're talking about multiple loaders, we have code signing invariance, sub-resource integrity, whatever you want to call it. But those generally need to happen at the final transform after everything has taken place. This makes it really hard because if loaders change the source text of things, as you add multiple loaders, you have to kind of be careful because each one you add is probably going to change the sub-resource integrity or code signing check for is the content approved. Kind of punted on that one again because we don't have code signing currently. We don't have sub-resource integrity. But it's something we need to kind of look out for and try to think about before we get too heavy-handed. Like I said earlier, we don't let you pass data between loaders. Mostly that's a hope that we can have things like transpilers do stuff in parallel using threads and things like that and alleviate some of the performance concerns. Not even with per package hooks, but just like transpilers being able to do stuff in parallel is nicer than having to do it all once in a synchronous way. And isolation kind of gives us an easier way to encourage that. So that's the second one. Oh, that one went over really quick, actually. Thought I was gonna ramble longer. No Q questions, nothing. So let's see. Our next one. This one was written by Gus Kaplan. Basically, people really like importing named imports from things. So he has written a way to allow importing names from node built-ins like the file system module. He even went through and made sure that live bindings work. So he does this by essentially taking a proxy and watching how CommonJS is mutating things and forwarding it out to the module record. Gus might be able to speak a little bit more on that than I can. I haven't been following the exact implementation of that as close as I could have been. So what does this look like? It's kind of what people are doing today in Babel. You import read file from FS, and then if you do stuff to FS, it gets forwarded and updated on the FS module record. This does not work for arbitrary things. So if we require Express or whatever in there and we update it, this is not going to magically make named imports from Express work. It's not going to have live bindings do anything for Express. So, yep. We talked about that a bit earlier today. There have been a few forays into trying to find a way to get named exports to work from just standard CommonJS modules, both from TC39, from people working on Nodes Loader, even userland, and we haven't found a way that works to spec currently. And the spec changes that we've requested to allow this with delayed bindings and things like that, or mutable module namespaces have all kind of stalled or been rejected. So, yep, unfortunate, but so we can get it for built-ins pretty easily, and that's good because people would like that. So we do have some considerations here as well that were taken into account and kind of things that showed up as we were going through the PR. So there are some deprecated functions and things that this has to track. And so as we're deprecating things, I think right now it's only deprecated things that aren't shown up or things with problems that don't show up. Is that right, Gus? You can speak to that more than me.
So deprecated properties, I'm trying to remember what I did. Deprecated properties, I think I read the read the getter and like go around that sort of to re-export them, and deprecated functions that would normally throw on access to like with a getter are wrapped in like a arrow function so that they throw on first call instead of first access. And I'm still like, I think at some point TSC said they would talk about like how deprecations should work for ESM. And I haven't seen them get back to me on that.
Cool. So this is the third PR that we're going to talk about. We have a question from Wes. If FS and other internal packages were external, which invariants would we be violating with this implementation? Graph stability and execution order. So that's a little hard to answer, but basically we statically know what exports there are, and we also know the built-ins don't have visible side effects when you load them up. So we can actually do this lazily, even though they're statically knowable. And that's what this does, because we know it won't have any side effects when we load them up, or visible side effects, I should say.
Technically, we're breaking the spec with this, I should mention, but it's low-key.
Nobody we know can visibly observe that we are violating execution order.
Yes.
So we could change it to be ahead of time, but that seems like effort for something that's not visible. Is that right?
Yeah, my first implementation of this was a .mjs for every .js in the source in the lib folder. But yeah, like you said, that's a lot of effort for something no one can see.
Guy Bedford. Oh, important to note, these proxies that are tracking mutation are not going to show up if you add random properties on these. So once the module namespace gets created, it is stable. But you're allowed to add things to the proxies. It just won't be respected in the ESM module record. Oh. So next PR, I don't think there's anything on the queue. No. Allow loading WebAssembly modules. This one is by Gus as well. This is basically introducing a new WASM format that loaders can take part in, including the default loader that we ship. This implementation does allow you to import other formats like JavaScript. This is not allowed by the JavaScript specification, but V8 allows it. We're currently in talks with TC39 about changing the spec text also. And there are a couple ways we can approach it, so we haven't actually done it, but it looks like the restriction of the spec here was added with concern for CommonJS, but it is not necessary. And so it looks like it's going to be removed eventually. Not yet, though. Still there. So what does that look like? You can import foo from, bar.wasm. And it gives you your named exports. Lynn gave a talk about WebAssembly and can probably speak a little bit to this in hers about plans. Yep. Oh, this is what it looks like. What? Okay. Well, yeah. So live bindings get hard from WASM. Currently, there's no real way for a WASM module to export a live binding exactly to JavaScript. There's no any type for it also to take stuff in. So that seems okay. But the initial set during instantiate is what you get. Cycles are technically possible with this because you can import JavaScript. The way this is set up, if you have a cycle from WebAssembly to JavaScript back to WebAssembly, it gets really confusing. I don't know if that works properly. Gus might be able to talk about that. But we're also getting the spec text changed, and there are two possible changes we can do, which is basically remove the guarantee that non-JavaScript modules aren't in cycles, or we can introduce a new module type into the JavaScript spec that allows you to participate in cycles. Gus says cycles need more testing. I think that's always true, no matter how far we go. So Yeah, and this is the last PR that I was going to talk about. I don't see any questions. Okay, and then we have some bonus round discussion. We do have an RFC for per package loader hooks. It introduces loader composition and package boundaries. I am all too happy to make a PR if we can address some concerns people have. So if you want more buy-in, either to say you hate it or you love it, feel free to go there. I think it's important to note that there are uses for scoping your loader hooks, even if we only have global ones. So having it able to be a first-class citizen to generate scopes is probably how I would frame discussions about it. So yeah. And then I've got time for discussion, which is what I wanted to do. Oh, yeah. Does anybody want to scroll back to discuss other things? Wes is asking if there's a way for a WASM module to share memory with other things. I don't think there's a way right now, because even with a shared array buffer, you would still need to create a JavaScript wrapping object for it to generate the import binding in JavaScript. And it's not a JavaScript object when it lands into WebAssembly, if I'm correct. So that's on WASM. So I don't see anything to talk about. Wes, did this kind of get back to your topic about MIME types that you were asking earlier?
Not really. I mean, insofar as MIME types are a thing that let you choose how to interpret a file, yes, they are a way to name those things. It doesn't solve the underlying issue of how to choose that thing in the first place, but the configuration option being there is important.
Okay. Not sure how we can address that. Is there something you would like to see added to mode or any of the other things to help address your concerns about declaring how you should determine format of any given thing?
I mean, so from my perspective, it's just like I effectively maintain an editor. If the editor is opened on a folder that's got a bunch of JS files in it, how do I interpret those JS files? Until someone tells me, I guess I can just choose to interpret them as modules like Babel does, or I can just choose to interpret them as script like the browser would if you put them all into a script tag, or I can choose to do like the thing where I try and guesstimate what each file is, like what TypeScript does today. Like all of those are just, they're a choice that you can make in the absence of actual configuration. I was hoping that maybe Node would offer some guidance and a default behavior on what to actually do when there's no configuration, but I guess not.
So do you mean in the case where there isn't a mode in the package.json?
No, not when there's not a mode in the package.json, but from like when we're talking about the wider ecosystem in general, when tools see a JavaScript file in the absence of configuration, how are they to handle it? It's not clear. It's not obvious. Like that's why like the unambiguous proposal exists, because you'd like to be able to determine or at least guess just from the file what it is. That's the actual problem. at least like from a tools perspective, we don't know how to treat a bare JavaScript file anymore. There are too many different ways to understand it, and we're adding more of them. That's the problem.
Right. So the mode would provide a way to tell.
Yes, that's
And
configuration.
predictable way.
That's why I'm okay with mode, because mode provides another place where a user can say, yes, I want this all to be Node style ESM. And all right, good. That tells me some stuff. It doesn't really help with when there's like just some old code base with a bunch of ESM syntax in it and index HTML, and I'm just like, I guess I just have to guess.
So what's interesting here is the way that Jay Dalton has dealt with this in WASM is by having different, so it's a mode, but basically like he's got the super strict mode that follows the exact Node semantics supporting MJS and exactly what Node modules implementation provides. But then he's got a looser mode that's more user-friendly for users to deal with the fact that, yeah, they do have code that does all these things today. So maybe some kind of hybrid approach like that might be more suitable.
Right.
But
I've actually spoke with Jay Dalton about his approach. It roughly approximates what we've been doing with TypeScript for a while. It's good. I was just hoping that we would, I don't know, standardize on it more, because like it is just a heuristic approximation. The fact that there's no guidance there is part of what makes it difficult to actually consider it a good thing.
Right. So I mean, it's I don't know, Bradley, is there a space for Node to provide guidance there?
We could mandate things, but that's generally frowned upon.
Like what I'm trying to say effectively is that like Node has the ESM mode where everything's going to be ISM, and that's great. And it's got the other mode where MJS is ESM and CommonJS is JS, and that's great. That's also unambiguous and a known way to work with things.
I think I can, before you go too far, there is some future work that was looked into. There's an older design, but might be suitable to you. There's this thing called the package mimes gist, and it's in a few places, but basically for TypeScript, Flow, whoever, JSX, I was calling it mimes. This was before the mode PR. And letting you load up these mime DBs and having your loaders resolve, request from Node's mime DB what a specific format is for any given URL, and it would give you a response back. If your concern is about scaling to like the far-flung future or to these like JSX language extensions where they kind of live as extensions to other things, this is one thing that we've looked at. We haven't really done anything with right now.
It's not about like the MIME-DB effectively lets a user say, this is how I want to treat every file in my program. For these extensions, treat them as these things. And that's all well and good. Mode does the same thing. All of these things are configuration options. It's what to do in the absence of configuration in the context of the broader ecosystem. There is a bunch of JavaScript out there already that tools need to understand how to process. And as we introduce new JavaScript that needs to behave differently, but by and large looks the same, it becomes even more confusing for us. And the fact that there is no standard guidance on how to treat these different formats or how to try and reify them and combine them in one unified system does not help. Like the fact, like people definitely need to be able to configure how to treat each file, because any heuristic thing is going to be able to get things wrong and they'll need to override it. And so that configuration needs to be there. But in the absence of that configuration, there needs to be something that's user-friendly as a default that can handle most things. And that's where there's no guidance, and every tool is pretty much doing their own thing. Like Jay Dalton's work is good. He's made it very user-friendly by default, and that's great. Like I've spoken to him about it over and over again. Babel has their unambiguous mode built in. It's not the default, but they at least provide it. That's great. It's just every tool in the ecosystem has some way to deal with this, but Node itself does not. And that's the frustrating part.
Can you define has a way to deal with this?
Has a way to attempt to derive meaning from a configuration list scenario where it is unclear how a given JavaScript file is supposed to be interpreted.
Okay, I have a response to that, but Jan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so it sounded to me like, and I might be projecting, but it sounded to me like the question was about a less complex way and a less configurable way and a less ambiguous way where it's not there's a way to configure and override, but just I open a file and I immediately know how to interpret the content without looking anywhere else. And I'm assuming that the file name would be in scope, and so
yes, and ideally in the context of code that already.
Let me just so basically, it is the thing that MJS would solve, right? So if MJS is a thing, then this is not a problem because there is no ambiguity. .js is common JS. .mjs is a module.
That's what I'm trying to say. MJS solves the problem for anyone writing MJS. It doesn't solve the problem in the context of all the code that already exists, that is written with a .js extension, that uses module syntax, that can be interpreted as modules, that will throw if you don't interpret it as modules in many cases.
But that's the problem of noisy data, right? So right now there's a lot of noisy data, and by definition, noisy data is noisy. So, I mean, there is no good answer for data cleanup other than everyone has to basically do the best they can, and every solution will be partially wrong.
Right, and like that's part of the problem. There's no agreed upon a way for all of these tools to be partially wrong in the same way. Babel's unambiguous grammar is slightly different than Webpack's, is slightly different than the ESM's, is slightly different than TypeScript's. They're all slightly different, and that does not help the problem.
Okay. Well, next up we have Gus.
So like in the context of you're like you have some configurationless project where you have no idea what's going on. Whatever scenario it was originally written for, like in the case of what you're saying, like you have a bunch of ESM files with the JS extension from 2015 when well, I guess MJS did exist in 2015, but you know, it's from some point when MJS hadn't been thought of yet. I think and you're loading them with Node, right? The only sane thing to do is to run them as common JS and then, you know, throw, because you can't have module syntax in that case. But for like the thing I've been thinking about is like the same way that Node exposes require.resolve, whatever the equivalent of that is for our loader, I guess loader.resolve, which, you know, goes through all the loader hooks and package maps and whatever else you have. If we just expose that for tooling, I think, you know, that's like probably the best solution.
Okay, next up, we're gonna get a little rushed because we're almost at time. Is John Dave Dalton?
Hi, I just wanted to touch on what Wes was mentioning. I'm actually working with Babel to make our unambiguous detections a little bit more consistent. Like right now, they'll be adding support for detecting that it's ESM if you use import.meta. Which is something that they didn't use before, and that's something that I key off of. So we're working from it from that standpoint. But having a way to detect or guess, like in Node, would be fantastic, because there is use cases where it does come in handy. For example, the Quokka use case where you start with a source text and then you need to be able to support ESM, and they use Node in the backend to power that. So that would be great if there was a blessed or even like as Gus was mentioning, like APIs to expose where it would try one thing, and if it fails, we could try the other thing. And then tooling can just go, okay, well, we tried to load it as ESM and it failed, and then we'll try to load it as script and do it that way. So I mean, things like that would be doable too, or acceptable.
Okay, and I just wanted to give a final response as well. You were mentioning how we're making .js files more and more polluted in meaning. I don't think that's going to change. I think if we were to standardize on something, we run some risks of not being forwards compatible. So I am very afraid of heuristic approaches because things like dynamic import landing in the script goal, the potential of nested imports somehow if we get import.meta added to the script goal, which I would like to see personally, and a variety of other things. It's very scary to me when we talk about heuristics without going through the standards bodies to make sure they're forwards compatible forever. And I don't see browsers adopting the same heuristics. So
I think exposing the low-level bits, like Gus was mentioning, avoids the heuristic thing from Node then. And it allows the tooling to try one approach. If it fails, try another approach, which is essentially creating their own heuristic. Try one. If it throws, then they'll try another.
So you can do that today with the resolve hook too. You just do it ahead of time. So yeah, we're at 2 minutes remaining. Any last comments by people?